want to welcome you to the first ever installment of the PGSG Lectureship Series. This is a new idea we're starting. We're hoping to have several lectures a year, bring diverse, noteworthy thinkers to Purdue, both for the benefit of graduate students, but also for the benefit of the broader campus community. We're looking for partners in these events, so if you belong to a program, school, college, that would like to partner with us on to bring a speaker into campus, please get in touch with me. You can find all of our contact information on our website, purdue.edu/PGSG. It's with very great honor that I get to introduce our two very distinguished guests today, Geoffrey Stone and Azhar Majeed. So just to tell you a little bit about them, Geoffrey Stone is the Edward H. Levi Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago. Stone joined the faculty in 1973 after serving as a law clerk to Supreme Court Justice William J. Brennan, Jr. He later served as Dean of the Law School from 1987 to 1994 and Provost of the University of Chicago from 1994 to 2002. Stone is the author of many books on constitutional law, great books, including Speaking Out, Reflections of Law, Liberty, and Justice, Top Secret, When Our Government Keeps Us in the Dark, War and Liberty, An American Dilemma, Perilous Times, Free Speech in Wartime, and Eternally Vigilant, Free Speech in the Modern Era. Stone is currently chief editor of a 20-volume series, Inalienable Rights, which is being published by the Oxford University Press. Stone recently served on the President's Review Group on Intelligence and Communications Technologies, and he gave a absolutely fantastic talk earlier today on the subject of NSA surveillance. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a member of the American Law Institute, the National Advisory Council of the American Civil Liberties Union, and a member of the American Philosophical Society. In recent years, he has served as chair of the board of the American Constitution Society as well. So he's had a very illustrious and distinguished career. Our other guest, Azhar Majeed, is director of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, Individual Rights Education Program. He's a native of Grosse Pointe, Michigan, and received a BA in Political Science with a minor in History from the University of Michigan in 2004. He is also a 2007 graduate of the University of Michigan School of Law. As an undergraduate, his academic interests included comparative constitutional law and political philosophy, particularly from the time period of the Enlightenment. Azhar was one of FIRE's inaugural Robert H. Jackson Legal Fellows and was also a FIRE legal intern in 2005. He has been published in the Georgetown Journal of Law and Public Policy, the Journal of College and University Law, and the Cardozo Journal of Law, Public Policy, and Ethics. So let's give a warm round of applause to both of our guests. To start out, I want to give a little bit of background. So about a year ago, I, on the graduate student government side, and Emily Watson on the undergraduate student government side, started looking into what were Purdue's policies relating to free speech, how good were they, were we living up to the commitments that we should make as a university community. And as part of that, we reached out to FIRE for an analysis of the current policies. That turned into a joint resolution coming from both student governments. And got unanimous support from both of our student governments. We continued to work on that and advocate for the policy changes, and with a great deal of help from President Daniels, that then turned into the Board of Trustees last May adopting all of the policy changes recommended by the student governments, but also going a big step further. And the step further was the adoption of the Chicago principles. So not merely adopting policies that were in line with First Amendment rights, but actually going further and proactively supporting academic freedom and free speech at the university. So really, that's our focus here tonight. What are the Chicago principles? Why are they important and why are they needed? And to give us an introduction on that subject, I'll just ask Professor Stone. So Professor Stone chaired the Committee on Freedom of Expression at University of Chicago that wrote the principles. So give us some background on what are they, what's in them, and how did they come about?
So a little over a year ago, the president of the University of Chicago asked me if I would chair a faculty committee to draft a statement on free expression for the university. And he explained that what precipitated this was the fact that there had been a number of instances at other colleges and universities across the country in which issues of free speech had arisen, including situations in which institutions had withdrawn invitations to various speakers, in which students had made complaints that had led to discipline about microaggressions and had demanded trigger warnings and the like. Although we had not at Chicago had any issues of any consequence along those lines, Zimmer thought that particularly because of the University of Chicago's own history of a commitment to free expression, that it would be useful for us to draft such a statement. And so he appointed a committee of 7 very distinguished faculty members from across the university, and we basically came up with a short, fairly succinct statement, very much built upon the history of the University of Chicago, drawing upon a series of statements made by presidents from the very founding of the university about the importance of academic freedom and free speech. If you're interested in seeing it, it's available. If you just Google Statement on Free Expression, University of Chicago, you'll find it. The core of it, the essence of it, derives from the notion that academic freedom is not a law of nature. It is a hard-bought acquisition over many centuries that is the product of resistance to efforts on the part of those who controlled universities for most of our history to censor any views that were seen as inconsistent with the judgments of those who ruled those institutions. In the 19th century, those were largely religious leaders who controlled universities and colleges and basically prohibited anyone to advocate any positions that were seen as morally incompatible with the religious doctrines. Later in the 19th century, the issue of Darwinism arose, and creationism was installed as a central principle that led to great battles in most institutions about whether Darwinism could be taught. Later on, as wealthy benefactors took on a role around the turn of the 20th century, they insisted that no one in universities should be permitted to say things that were critical of their business practices. In World War I, there was an effort to suppress any speech on university campuses that was critical of the war. And then there was the McCarthy era and so on. So basically, it's been a challenge from the very beginning for universities to maintain an atmosphere in which students and faculty are free to say what they think, to argue for what they believe in, without the university as an institution stepping in and saying, no, we reject that position. We reject that argument. We reject that proposition. You cannot say that. And universities have fought for many decades to establish the tradition of freedom of expression. And it really exists for a couple of reasons. I mean, part of it is that universities themselves are, of course, dedicated to the proposition of the discovery of truth. And the belief is that the discovery of truth is most likely to occur in a situation in which ideas are allowed to fight evenly and openly with one another. Second is a great distrust of people in authority. That if we cede to whether it's trustees or presidents or deans or faculty groups or whatever, the power to determine what views may be expressed and what may not be expressed, there's absolutely no reason to believe that they will be acting out of whatever the right judgments might be. And the third point is basically one of understanding that what were once thought to be wrong ideas or bad ideas over time turn out to be good ideas and are accepted by the majority of the community. And unless we allow them to fight in a free fight, we'll never even get to that point. So this is a battle that universities have fought for a very long time. And the Chicago Principles basically attempt in a short form to make clear that the university has absolutely no business ever censoring ideas because anyone in the university thinks those ideas are improper or loathsome or fraught with danger. That there are circumstances in which speech can be restricted, direct threats, instances of direct one-on-one harassment, defamation, but in the realm of ideas themselves, the university has no role to play, and that the proper response to ideas that we dislike is not to seek the university to come in and intervene, but to fight about the propriety and the wisdom of those ideas among ourselves. And in the end, the assumption is that is the best way to achieve truth, and the best way to work out the academic culture that universities aspire to. So that's basically the background and the core of what the principles were about.
So, Azhar, FIRE sees this day to day on the issues that come up on campus. So talk a little bit about what are the sorts of things that happen on campuses that the principals are really addressing and getting at?
Well, I could talk all day about the types of cases that we see on college campuses. Really what it comes down to is censorship of viewpoints that are simply in the minority on campus, things that are offensive to students or faculty members, really anything that somebody finds to be contestable, disagreeable, offensive, or wrong-headed. And as Professor Stone so eloquently put it, the proper response to ideas and viewpoints that you find to be abhorrent is to use your own voice, to speak out, and to let that speaker and other people know why you are in the right and why what they're saying is the wrong view. Unfortunately, what we see is that universities are too quick to pull the trigger on censorship, to take disciplinary action, and to undertake prolonged investigations of students as well as faculty members for those kinds of viewpoints. Not only that, but what we're seeing increasingly, I would say, over the last several months and years, is that students themselves are more than eager to really call for the censorship of their fellow students. And this is a worrisome trend for many reasons, not the least of which is that students are misunderstanding what the First Amendment and what academic freedom really stand for. And students are really failing to understand that it could be their own speech, their own viewpoints that get censored in another instance. And that type of short-sighted understanding of the First Amendment and of free speech really is a worrisome trend and something that we're seeing all too often these days.
So I want to focus in on that, the nature, the amount to which it's coming from students versus administrative bureaucracy versus other sources. But first I want to make a note because I forgot to do this. This is completely a discussion forum, so I'll offer up some more questions, we'll talk for a little bit, but please, as we're speaking, come up with your own questions. What are you interested in hearing? And then come up and you can form lines at each of the two mics. And as I see that there are a decent number of questions, I'll turn it completely over to the audience and you can ask about any subject that you'd like to ask about. So back to the subject. Is it, what's the balance? Is it usually administrators that is it usually students now? Where do you see that most at FIRE?
I mean, I would still say it's in the majority. It is college administrators, whether it be somebody like a dean of students or a dean of student life, res hall administrators. It is still in the majority, I would say, administrators that are cracking down on student speech as well as faculty speech. However, there is that increasing trend of students themselves calling for censorship. And FIRE's president, Greg Lukianoff, wrote a great book a couple of years ago called Freedom from Speech. And that's something that we're seeing more and more. Students not only misunderstand what freedom of speech means, but they increasingly seem to have the idea that there's this freedom from speech on college campuses and really in society at large. And to expound on that, the idea is that I have a right to be free from certain viewpoints, to not hear anything that upsets me, and to not be confronted with ideas that I find to be disagreeable for whatever reason. And when you see that, and when you see students acting upon that wrong impulse, you really worry about where we as a society, not just in terms of higher education, but really society at large, where we're going and where we'll end up in terms of free speech rights and the ability to take part in open discourse.
And so what would your take be on it, Professor Stone?
So it's interesting that I think the momentum for the current wave of demands of censorship comes almost entirely from students. And to the extent administrators are acting upon them, it's because of the students' demands, less than because the administrators themselves think this is what the ideal should be. And it's quite anomalous historically. It's always been the case, literally, that it's been students who have demanded free speech and the trustees of the university, the leaders of the university who've said, no, you're not capable of free speech. You're not old enough to hear these ideas. You can't be trusted with these ideas. So we're going to not let you hear these things that we think are inappropriate for your ears. And it's been students who've always, for the past 2 centuries, who've fought back against that. And it's really quite stunning to hear now students who are the ones who are demanding that ideas be suppressed and that they be shielded from hearing things that they find upsetting or distasteful. And the other interesting thing about this, by the way, which is worth noting, is that historically it has always been progressives, liberals, who have demanded the right to free speech, and political conservatives who've basically been the ones who have said, no, that's not so important, whether it's the religious arguments or the economic business arguments or the anti-unpatriotism arguments. It's always been conservatives who've basically been the ones who've taken the lead in wanting to squelch free speech. And the other thing that's flipped at the moment, which is really odd, is that we have basically people who think of themselves as progressives or as liberals, who are the ones who are attempting to suppress other people's expression. And the flip side of that is it's conservatives who are now basically saying, no, we have to defend free speech. And that's, for anyone who's seen this over the period of time, this is a really confounding development, and one that I find quite discomforting. I think students should be the champions of free speech and should be the ones who are not demanding that their superiors silence them. It's a very odd state of affairs.
And I wanted to add on something to that, which is that censorship and calls for restrictions on speech seem to be taking more subtle forms and really different forms than just plain out calls for censorship. What we're seeing now is students increasingly calling for trigger warnings in academic materials, on course syllabi, and similar materials, and to the point where it intrudes upon professors' academic freedom. We're also seeing students at campuses across the country really, decrying so-called microaggressions. Instances of speech that to everyday citizens are fairly tame and innocuous, but in those students' eyes are acts that need to be acted upon by the university. And similarly, we're seeing the increasing invocation of safe spaces. The idea that campuses or particular areas of campus need to be free from any viewpoint or any speech really on certain topics which might be offensive to some or hurtful. And when you have people making these kind of broad-based calls for censorship and restriction of speech in forms that frankly weren't around years ago, that too is something to monitor and to fight against.
The other thing I think it's important to understand about the nature of free speech is that to believe in free speech doesn't mean that you believe the ideas that others espouse are good. They may be, in fact, loathsome and ugly and hateful or stupid. But to believe in free speech is to say, okay, I'm going to tell you they're loathsome and stupid and why you should reject them yourself and why others should reject them, as opposed to trying to silence them. But it's important to separate the notion of a belief in free speech and a belief that all ideas are equal. They're not. There are good ideas and there are bad ideas. It's just that we don't all agree on what the good ideas and bad ideas are, and no one should make that judgment for us.
I can say, at least for myself, that I certainly don't want to be on the other end of an idea that Professor Stone thinks is loathsome or stupid. But I think I'd like to focus in on safe spaces. So historically, or in a general sense, a university is looked at as a place to specifically challenge received wisdom. So to look at what we think we know and say, do we really know that we know that? Could you, Professor Stone, elaborate on, in what ways thinking of a university as a safe space is detrimental to the real mission of a university?
So I'm of two minds about this kind of an issue. On the one hand, I believe that a central part of my responsibility as a teacher and a central part of the responsibility of a university or a college within students is to prepare our students to be effective, courageous citizens in the real world, to have the intellectual skills and the personality to be able to stand up for oneself, to defend one's positions, to explain why others are wrong, and not to cower or to be afraid or to be reluctant to engage in intellectual combat. I think our job is to make good citizens, and good citizens are people who are capable of having courage and defending their views. And I worry that the impetus for a lot of the censorship today is basically saying, I don't want to be in that position. I don't want to have to fight back. And that, I think, asks universities to do exactly what they're not supposed to do. On the other hand, I do think we have to be cognizant of the fact that we want universities to be places in which people are civil. That's a value that is important, not to the point of censorship, but as an aspiration. It's something universities should encourage. And I think we also have to be aware of the fact that it is tough to be a student in an environment in which all of your ideas are open to challenge and to question, and that universities have to be cognizant of the fact that they want to be able to make sure students can flourish in the institution. The idea is not to destroy students, it's to strengthen them. And therefore, I think we have to think about situations in which it may be that there is a really difficult situation created for students. Now, that does not ever, in my view, mean censorship, but it might mean support in a variety of ways. It may mean counseling in a variety of ways. I don't think we should simply blind ourselves to the fact that life is hard and not all of our students are capable of dealing with it equally. And therefore, it is important to be attentive to the fact that we need to nurture the kind of values in our students that we want them to have upon graduation. And so I don't think safe spaces as such are a good idea. A good example of this for me is microaggressions. I grew up being educated to the fact that there are certain things you didn't say. There are certain things you didn't say about certain groups because they were ugly and they were rude and it was nasty, and you didn't do it. It was uncivil. It wasn't illegal, it wasn't censored, but it was something you were taught not to do. And now I hear that there are these things called microaggressions, which I have to admit my initial reaction is to poo-poo them and say, this is silly, right? But then I realized I grew up actually being sensitive to what would today be called microaggressions. Now, maybe there are more microaggressions that genuinely have the same kind of nasty quality to them that the expressions I grew up learning not to say had. And so I don't think the university should ever intervene in this, but I think we as citizens of a community should be respectful of one another and should be civil, and that universities should encourage civility in discourse. The idea of argument is to talk about the merits, not to be engaged in ugly name-calling that serves no legitimate purpose.
So please do remember, be thinking of questions and come up to the mics.
Be courageous.
Be courageous. I promise Professor Stone, even if he finds what you say loathsome and stupid, won't be too hard on you.
I wouldn't go that far.
Okay, well, I won't anyway.
You've got some questions if you want them.
Oh, sure.
I think it's widely believed, and I think you even said it was in the Chicago statement, that schools should be able to step in cases of harassment and in terms like that. But there's often a large gray area associated with what is freedom of speech and what becomes harassment and what becomes illegal. I think it was one court justice that said one man is free to swing his fist until the next man's nose, which is essentially saying that you have your own freedoms until they infringe on someone else's freedoms. How is it possible to find that line of things that are just ugly and things that are loathsome and things that would be put in this term of harassment and need to be addressed?
So harassment, for these purposes, is defined as the repeated, continuing pursuit of an individual by another over the objection of the target individual. It does not mean using speech that offends somebody.
Okay.
It means basically going after somebody repeatedly after they say, leave me alone. Okay, one-on-one. That's basically what harassment means in this context. There are gray areas, and anyone like myself who studied the First Amendment for most of my career knows there are always going to be gray areas. No rules are going to be without them. And there's, I guess, two things to say about that. One is the gray area should be defined very narrowly in the realm of free speech. So defamation means basically a false statement of fact made about another individual, where the person who makes the statement was reckless in being false. It doesn't mean saying something that criticizes another person. That's not defamation, right? A threat is not something that makes you feel uncomfortable. It's just, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to kill you, right? So these are concepts that have meanings, and the meanings are generally narrow, and they're narrow in part because one of the things we've learned with experience is that if they're not defined narrowly, they easily are subject to abuse. And they're used by people who basically want to silence ideas in the guise of saying, that's a threat, that's harassment, right? That's defamation. So these concepts come to be defined very narrowly to avoid their misuse in those ways. Now, there's still going to be gray areas, but the presumption should always be that these are narrowly defined concepts, and they're meant to get at very serious harms that are not the product of ideas, right? The fact that an idea seems defamatory, seems threatening, seems offensive, you can't restrict it. Does that help?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I want to go to, so speaking of gray areas and the potential that if these policies aren't narrowly defined, that they're ripe for abuse. I think Azhar can probably speak to, I can think of a couple examples involving Game of Thrones and Firefly particularly that speak to that.
Yeah, I would say with respect to that question, there's no problem with the university conducting a good faith investigation into whether or not an allegation of harassment turns out to be true. I would just say that once it becomes clear that you're dealing with protected speech and not something that rises to the level of harassment or a true threat, then at that point it's incumbent upon the university to end an investigation, not let it become a prolonged investigation. With respect to the cases that Andrew just referred to, I guess I'll just focus on Firefly. Fire has a huge set of archives of cases you can always look at. Most of our cases are not really close calls, constitutionally speaking. They're clear infringements on free speech or academic freedom and related rights. The Firefly case was at the University of Wisconsin-Stout, where a professor put up a poster outside of his office door, which was quoting a sci-fi show called Firefly, and because it referred to killing, he was brought in under the university's threat assessment team and had his censor postered, as well as a follow-up poster in which he, basically it was a satirical poster making fun of what he saw as fascism on the part of the university police, and that poster was censored. And really, this is a case going back to 2011, but it is a memorable case for our case archives. And also, it just goes to show you that it doesn't have to be speech that's politically divisive or controversial. Sometimes these cases just become just flat out silly and matters that should have never gotten to the level of censorship and the intervention of fire in the first place. Those are the clear-cut cases that demonstrate that universities oftentimes just don't understand what the law requires in terms of First Amendment rights.
And to be more particular about what the second poster that got censored, the fascism poster, said something like, warning fascism, fascism may cause blunt trauma,
right.
Keep pets and children away from fascism. And how that becomes a threat to anyone other than fascists, I suppose. I don't know anyway. Let's go over here for a question.
Thank you. In my communications class, we have an extensive list of banned topics ranging from legalization of weed to religion to something as simple as the Purdue Dance Marathon. Our instructor argues that these topics are either too boring or too controversial. Such that these presentations do not make direct threats or defame others, does such a list have a place in the academic environment?
Well, you're talking about in the classroom?
In the classroom and the university in general.
The legalization of marijuana?
So, like a banned topics list. Any banned topics list.
In my view, there should be no such thing as a banned topics list in the discourse of a university. In individual classes, a teacher has to decide what they are teaching. And so if I'm teaching a course on the First Amendment and a student wants to give a speech on calculus, I'm going to say, sorry, that's not this course. and that's okay, right? But in terms of banned topics, I don't think there should be any banned topics. Abortion is good, abortion is bad. You know, legalizing weed is good, legalizing weed is bad. Affirmative action is good, affirmative action is bad. Those are just topics for discussion. There should be, none of this should be. In a class, it's different. Classes have to have a certain focus and an agenda, and free speech doesn't operate in the same way inside a classroom.
To clarify, that's the communication course where you're doing public speaking?
Public
so,
speaking,
So it's a
yes.
topic that you're choosing to do your particular speaking about?
That's correct.
So in that context.
Like a radio show, you mean?
No, so it's the introductory, let me make sure that
sorry, I don't-
it's the introductory level, because I'm very interested in this, because I heard of the same thing. It's the introductory communication course, so it's public speaking. So you're supposed to choose a topic and then do a speech on that topic, and then there's this list
Yes.
of topics that are verboten for doing this.
I mean, I would think a professor could give a list of topics that she wants the students to focus on for some academic reason, and that would be perfectly appropriate. But to take off the list a series of topics simply because the professor thinks they're inappropriate or offensive, if they're otherwise, you can pick anything you want, I would think that inappropriate.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Okay, we'll go over here.
Yes, I know of an award-winning Purdue employee who led a surprisingly successful grassroots efforts to oppose forced annexation by the city of West Lafayette, and that upset the local mayor, who complained to a Purdue vice president, and the employee since then has been repeatedly threatened with his job and other disciplinary actions repeatedly if he continued to engage in any First Amendment activities, writing to the paper, speaking to the city council about the topic and such. When he complained through channels, the appropriate established channels, he was disciplined and had job responsibilities taken from him. I guess I'm asking people who do this for a living, what could or should this fellow be doing to resolve his situation? Because the university currently is only offering to have him resign with a gag order and a small severance package.
You know, that's an interesting question. I would say, you know, so I should clarify one thing. Fire defends the rights of students and faculty members. You know, we do recognize that when it comes to non-faculty employees at colleges and universities, schools do have some greater leeway under the law to regulate their speech to make sure it's, you know, really to maintain the functioning of the workplace. There's a Supreme Court decision going back to 2006 called Garcetti v. Ceballos, which you know, narrows the speech rights of public employees, which includes employees at a public university. You know, the Supreme Court didn't explicitly say this, but it hinted at an exception to that rule for faculty members due to their academic freedom rights and so on. But under Garcetti, there is the question of whether public employees, including at a public university, really have broad First Amendment rights in the employment setting. And so pursuant to that, I would say that the university does have some greater leeway to regulate.
Oh, okay, but the employee was speaking as a citizen, not an employee, and an issue of personal and community interest, not at the university or against the university. That's where I'm wondering, you know, I've heard about Garcetti and some of the other things, you know, where you can't speak against your employer or interrupt the functions of your workplace, but when it's about whether your neighborhood gets annexed by the local city, it would seem maybe not to apply to what you're talking about.
Yeah, sure. And so there is that question of whether this really should be, you know, protected as a citizen speaking on a matter of public interest. I think you can make a pretty compelling case that it should be. I think I would simply say that post Garcetti, it is a question of really what speech rights remain for public employees, including at a public university.
Very good. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. We'll go over here.
With regard to, I guess, student organizations, if someone were like a member of an organization that preferred grape jelly on their toast, would they be able to like ban or suppress within that student organization the strawberry lovers, as long as they're the ability for the strawberry lovers to have their own organization? Does that make sense?
Yes. It actually does. Organizations, whether it be student organizations or political parties or whatever, that exist in part for purposes of association and expression have their own right to determine their membership to ensure that the association will further its purposes. So the Democratic Party can exclude Republicans from voting for their primary candidates. And a student organization that wants to advocate gay rights can exclude people who are not going to support gay rights. And an organization that wants to support strawberry jam can, and the reason for this, by the way, is because otherwise it would be impossible effectively to exercise the associational rights in the face of others who want to undermine them. So if they want to argue the opposite position, that's their prerogative and that's their right. But if they want to essentially try to take over the organization from inside and subvert it, then you'd never have minority organizations, right? So if you think of the NAACP in the South in the 1950s, if white Southerners had a right to join the NAACP in the South over the objections of the organizers of the NAACP, they would destroy the NAACP. And so in that context, the associational rights of the organization are thought to be sufficiently strong to allow them to determine who their members would be.
Thank you.
I just want to say that I loved the jam example.
I would never have thought of that.
I'm a local townsperson, and I've worked on campus and at local bars around campus. I don't recognize anybody, thankfully. But
They all recognize you.
oh, they do. When they see me, they recognize me sometimes. But sometimes I wonder about some of our little special snowflakes, not the Purdue's, but we don't have any here. Purdue's not like that, but in the news. And I just wonder sometimes if people, college students of this era right now, do not have enough. They don't have enough enough skin, enough sense of humor. It seems like some of these things, these microaggressions that you hear about, trigger warnings, all these little things like that, and I'm just like, I don't understand. I guess it's because I'm 40 years old that I don't understand how people don't have a thick enough skin to just let it roll off or to laugh it off. I don't feel like people have enough of a sense of humor on some of these topics, especially on the progressive liberal side where they see something and it's actually like a joke or a parody or satire, and they can't take it as such and enjoy it, laugh, and move on. That there's so much seriousness to the point of absurdity. Do you know what I mean?
To me, I don't see it so much. Yeah, those are great observations. I don't see it so much as something that has to be inherent with that group of with that generation or that group of individuals, so much as it is maybe a cultural thing, and the fact that people have been misinformed about what their rights really are and what other people's rights really are. Again, that idea of freedom from speech. The idea that I have a right not to be offended, and as a student at this university, I have a right to go to class and to go about my affairs without ever confronting an idea that upsets me or makes me rethink my own positions. And that's a dangerous notion that I should go through 4 years of college unchallenged in what I believe, and not just unchallenged, but not even have to confront such other viewpoints. And so I think that has become too ingrained in the culture and just in people's ideas of what open discourse is or is not. So again, I don't think it's something inherent in people. I think it's what they've been taught and what they have unfortunately internalized.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much for the question. And I want to add or to explore a little bit more on, there are truly awful statements that are made, and people at Purdue have been victims of truly awful statements. And when those happen, it's up to each of us as individuals to respond to that and to roundly condemn that sort of attitude and that sort of behavior. I think the position or the attitude of everyone, we all three completely agree, I assume, on that. Where it differs is in who makes that case. Is it the institution who punishes the student or the individual who says such awful, terrible things, or is it our condemnation? Is it our words and our showing a better path forward? that makes that case. But to the point of humor, that's actually something I want to give you a chance to plug FIRE's latest work on the documentary.
Yeah, well, thank you for giving me that chance. It's FIRE put together a documentary very recently. It's called Can We Take a Joke? It has a number of great comedians in it, talking about the fact that this is really an issue that goes beyond higher education and beyond 18 to 22-year-old students right now. That culturally speaking, we as a society have lost the ability to laugh at ourselves and to take a joke for really what it is and to not take it for what it's not. This documentary, you can check it out on FIRE's website. I think it's a much needed, timely piece on really where we are as a society in terms of addressing things like humor and parody and satire. And I think it's very relevant to college campuses today.
I haven't seen the documentary, so I can't comment on that. But my own sense is that there is a heavy generational issue here, and that it's a bit of a cliche, and I don't know if it would be demonstrable with empirical evidence and data, but the widely shared perception is that this generation of young people have been raised to a much greater degree than their predecessors in a way that has been pampered and protected, and everybody wins, and everything is made okay, and risk-taking is diffused, and that they bring that with them into their college experience, and that in some sense they're less prepared for the roughness of a college discourse, including the ugliness that can sometimes arise. And I think that's probably true. Again, I'm not a social scientist, I haven't studied this, but it does seem to be a pretty common perception among people who've thought about it. And there's been a radical change in the absence of thick skin on the part of this current generation of college students. And I do believe this is part of the helicopter parent business and all the rest of it. And I think that's worrisome for us as a society. I mean, I do believe that we will flourish best when people are, to use the same phrases I used earlier, courageous and tough-minded and independent and fearless. And I don't think it bodes well for us if people are timid and feel the need to be protected from ideas.
So as a nation, we clearly value equality of opportunity a lot. Like, we give people federal financial aid, we give low-income students a lot of different benefits and things like that. So at the point that if there are microaggressions and hate speech and things like that, even from professors or whatnot, like if that's hindering certain students' ability to succeed in an academic environment, how do we balance the ideas of free speech? Like, if a professor is, having these microaggressions against students and like precluding them from succeeding, how do we balance this desire for free speech with this desire to have like equality of opportunity?
Well, first of all, professors shouldn't be uncivil or disrespectful to their students. But at the same time, the real world will not protect people from that type of upset. And therefore, I think we do a grave disservice to our students by creating a safe space of a university that shields them from ugliness and from discord and from insult when it exists in the world. Again, my view is the point of education is to prepare students to be effective citizens. Effective citizens cannot be thin-skinned. And that doesn't mean I think faculty should be abusive to students for the sake of it, but I also think that this is part of the reality of life. And one might imagine a Peter Pan world in which there is no reality, but that's not our world. And I want my students to be able to go into that world and to be fearless and to be able to take challenge and insult. They shouldn't, ideally, in the ideal world, they shouldn't, but that's the world in which we live, and I don't want our students to be shielded from things that they have to learn how to deal with.
Can I have a follow-up?
Well, if you wouldn't mind, I also, I would like to point out here, it's not like students are powerless in the face of, something that they come across that's disagreeable. One student may feel like, as an isolated individual, there's not much they can do structurally within a university. But, as we're seeing on college campuses across the country, when many students band together and make their voices heard, that can effect a lot of change and lead to widespread dialogue and discussion on important issues facing students both on campus and in society at large. And so I think that really goes to show you that students are not powerless victims and don't have to remain powerless victims.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure if we're supposed to do this, but I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Amanda, and I'm a PhD student in industrial engineering. And I have a question about zero tolerance. Zero tolerance has become a response policy that we've seen throughout education in response to different things, not only issues of speech. And on one hand, I believe its cause is to treat people equitably, which is a fair goal. But I don't think it's used very well, and it's often used, I see, as a cop-out by administrators to not have to use the critical judgment and make a human assessment. And so I was wondering if you could speak to kind of the history of zero tolerance policies that have been used across education, not just for speech, and their applicability to free speech.
And just to clarify, what do you mean by zero
Oh,
tolerance?
thank you, because I thought my age was showing.
I mean, I could guess at what you mean by that, but I just wanted to clarify.
So what comes to mind is examples where we've had things that are considered weapons on campus. So sometimes you see in the news that a third grader brought a butter knife to school and they're expelled because there's zero tolerance for weapons.
Okay, well, something like that, I would say, that's not within the purview of what my organization does, simply because it's not a speech issue. I think, but having said that, as a broader cultural issue, I do worry about overreactions to very simple and easily addressable types of issues. It goes to some of the coddling and helicopter parenting that Professor Stone mentioned a few minutes ago. There's that concern that there's a point to be made that the answer to everything is not to have the school step in and intervene on behalf of a student or a parent or a teacher or whatever. Many things can be resolved without that kind of heavy-handed administrative action. Again, I don't know if that answers your question, but without, I guess a more specific understanding of what you mean by zero tolerance, it's hard to answer.
Well, I was just talking about that mentality of
Sure.
this full reaction and one reaction to any sort of negative thing that goes on in an educational environment, and having one reaction from administration that applies to all of that.
Yeah, so yeah, I think my answer kind of remains the same. There seems to be like a common sense approach that's missing too often, and an overreaction to coddle or protect students. And I think that's harmful for many reasons, not the least of which is that it teaches students not to, instead of relying upon themselves and their own capabilities, but to instead run to the authorities anytime there's a problem or even a perceived problem. And I think that that ill serves us as a society moving forward.
Thank you.
I think this gets at an important point, though, which is the distinction of a college student's rights and a college student's speech and a K-12 student's speech. So, Professor Stone, could you briefly sort of, what's the difference between those? And then do you think, either of you, that the limitation of some of those speech rights in K through 12 contributes to issues that we see in college speech rights?
Even for K through 12, the Supreme Court has held that schools can't prohibit the expression of ideas unless they can at least demonstrate that the speech substantially and materially interferes with the actual functioning of the school. So even 10-year-olds have these rights, according to the Supreme Court. Now, they are different and lesser rights with young kids, obviously, than they are with adults. And 12-year-olds can't handle certain types of ideas in the same way that 20-year-olds can. And that's true, they can't drive, they can't vote. And so there is a degree of intervention that's appropriate with younger kids that wouldn't be true for college students. But even there, the Supreme Court has basically said that even kids in high school have real First Amendment rights that can't be just overridden by school officials because they don't like the ideas. The famous case that dealt with this, by the way, was during the Vietnam War, was a student who came to class wearing black armbands to protest the war. And the school suspended the student, Mary Beth Tinker, for doing that because it upset some other students who didn't think criticism of the war was appropriate. And the Supreme Court said that violated the First Amendment. Too bad if it upsets kids. Unless it substantially, materially prevents the school from fulfilling its mission, being upset is not something you have a right to be protected against, even if you're in elementary school or high school.
Thank you. So we have a little over 5 minutes left and 3 speakers, so we should be able to get through everyone's questions as long as people ask questions relatively quickly. So,
all right, I got an easy one for you guys. So last week I'm at home watching Sports Center, and the topic of students and student athletes and student athlete social media policy comes up. So I was wondering, do student athlete social media policies infringe on students' First Amendment rights?
Yeah, that's a good question. We get that from time to time at FIRE. I would say that student athletes, insofar as they are representatives of a university, have lesser rights when it comes to speech or social media speech when they can reasonably be perceived as speaking in their capacity as student athletes. Now, if a student athlete or a team speaks out on a particular issue, but then those students are punished in their capacity as students, that's a different issue. Like if you get something that goes in your student record or your student file, that's a concern and possibly a free speech issue. But if you suffer consequences internally within the team, like you lose your spot in the starting lineup or something like that, that's obviously not going to be a free speech issue, simply because as representatives of the university, they are subject to those types of internal regulations. Having said that, the University of Missouri football team and the position it took on campus racial issues there goes to show you that student athletes can play a powerful role when it comes to highlighting and raising public awareness of important issues of the day. They just, frankly, have to be prepared to possibly suffer the internal consequences of taking those on. But it may well be that that's important enough to them that they're willing to do that.
Well, part of it turns on whether the individual is speaking on behalf of the institution or as an individual. So compare 2 situations. One is a faculty member writes a scholarly article that takes a certain position which is controversial, highly provocative, and alienates a lot of people. And that professor would be absolutely protected by academic freedom. And then compare that to someone who writes the alumni magazine for the university. And they take it upon themselves to write the same controversial, provocative thing. That person is speaking for the university, does not have academic freedom in the same way vis-a-vis the university, because they are the voice of the university, and therefore their speech can be restricted. And the football team players, the athletes, depend on what their relationship is and who they're speaking for. But they're in a kind of intermediate situation. They're leveraging the fact that they are student athletes to get publicity, to get visibility, so they're in a kind of funny in-between position.
Thank you.
Hi, my question goes back to the incident that happened earlier this year at the University of Oklahoma with the Sigma Alpha Epsilon fraternity and the video that surfaced with the racist chant. I wanted to get your all's opinion on how the university handled that, if you think they should have handled it differently, they handled it well, what should have happened with that?
So this was a situation where a group of fraternity members in a bus on the way to a party were chanting in a way that was clearly racist and used the word nigger, and one of the people on the bus used their phone to record it and circulated it. And the university banned the fraternity and expelled or suspended the students. I think that violated the First Amendment. I think what those students did was ugly, but I don't think that the university could, consistent with the First Amendment, do what it did. The students didn't sue. They decided to make it go away because they didn't want to become any more visible than they already were for their conduct. But I have very little doubt that if they had sued, they would have won.
Not only that, but if I remember correctly, they summarily expelled some or all of those students without any kind of a hearing or a chance to defend themselves. And so that obviously raises due process concerns, again, at a public university, which is obligated to provide its students due process for that type of, really any type of a policy violation. And it seems like just because of how much negative publicity there was surrounding that case, the university also, kind of like those students, wanted to make it go away as quickly as they could and to take swift action by expelling or suspending, I believe expelling those students. And so, the failure to provide any type of chance to defend themselves is a problem as well.
And what makes that case particularly odd is the students, again, as ugly and as deplorable as their conduct was, they weren't actually trying to have it be seen by anybody else except the people in their own bus. It was somebody else who actually broadcast it to the world that created all the offense. So in that sense, they're not, again, I don't want to defend them in terms of their judgment, but they were not actually trying to do anything that was going to offend anybody who wasn't in the bus, who were their own group. So it was a little weird that it got the attention it got.
If you don't mind me asking, how do you think the university should have dealt with that?
I think they should have condemned what the students did and said this was uncivil behavior and said, but they have a First Amendment right to do it.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Right. Okay, so we technically are out of time, but we'll extend a little bit so that we can make sure to get to our two last questions.
Okay, hopefully this won't be too long. My question is, what can we as a student or as essentially the little guy do when we see something as simple as a teacher putting a banned list topic on a speech class or the university cracking down on something where they didn't have the authority to crack down on that, where they're offending these rights? What options do we have to take as a student to prevent this in the future or to try and reverse what was done that we think was against the Constitution?
I think raising awareness and drawing publicity to those kinds of issues is really the biggest weapon that students have. Universities are oftentimes hesitant to defend in public that which they try to do behind closed doors. And that's speaking broadly in terms of trends that we see across the country. And so raising awareness amongst your fellow students, engaging in the type of campus activism that lets people know that you really care about these issues, that can go a long way. And that could be take many forms, whether it be writing an op-ed in the student paper, organizing a student group event on campus, meeting with other students and student groups. There's no shortage of ways in which you can raise that kind of awareness. And the same thing goes for using media or social media or other types of outlets to amplify your voice. So really, that's the biggest piece of advice I can give on that point.
Thank you.
Sure.
Our final question.
Thanks for coming. I have two short questions, actually. The first question is about Christianity. I'm not from here. As an international student, I think Christianity really is a life-changing experience. I view myself as a new Christian, but I want to know, in America, the thriving of Christianity is also based on the freedom of religion. But as we know, as the year goes, the number of Christians is reducing right now. But among the student Christian fellowship on a college setting, how can we create an environment or fellowship that could combine the heritage of Christianity as well as the modern values? Or say, when I raise my own kids, how can I teach them to embrace God at the same time also embrace the modern values like respect and freedom of think? Thank you.
I'm a Jewish atheist, so I don't think I can answer that.
And I'm a non-practicing Muslim, so I'm not sure I can answer that question either.
Okay. Second question.
Well, I think it's a very important question, though. But the second question is about, it's a little bit confusing, but I'll try to clarify. I think in modern time, we say, in a family, say, I'm from China, so we've been taught about the value of respect our elders. And also, like, say, in a company interview setting, say, like, interviewees have to, like, respect the interviewers. But I want to know, like, about the art of conversation, the art of debate, art of arguments. How can we voice our concerns, and also, like, how the freedom of think without, like, sounding arrogant, without offending people, and also in a culture where, like, entertainment, jokes, personal charm, leadership behavior is sometimes like valued more above the value of ideas, the value of personal opinions. Like, how can you find a space or personal balance in it? Thank you.
Donald Trump seems to have done it pretty well. I'm kidding. That's a joke. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it always comes down to being civil, respectful, and polite. I think if you treat people the way that you would want to be treated, that is something to aspire to. And in my experience, I think many people would say the same thing. That's the most effective way to reach people. As a First Amendment advocate, am I going to defend your right to be uncivil and to not show respect to somebody? Yes, as long as it's protected speech. But that might not be the best way to win yourself allies and to convince other people and get your message across. So I think those values of civility and politeness and respect, those are to be aspired to as a normative matter, even if it's not something that should be legally required of you, either under university policy or under the law.
And the best advice I can give, which I've learned a long time ago, is when arguing, debating with people, is to put myself inside their head and understand what they're hearing and how they hear it, and couch arguments in a way that will be most effective for where they're coming from, as well as being civil and respectful. And I think if one is conscious of doing that, one can be very effective, both as persuasion, but also in terms of civility.
Yeah, but I think what I'm thinking was sometimes the extroverts have fairly larger advantage over introverts.
Yes, maybe, sometimes. That may be true. But it depends on the circumstance, and it depends how much of an extrovert. But lots of people have advantages over each other in all sorts of ways. And we all have to deal with our own strengths and weaknesses and take advantage of the strengths and figure out how to build off the weaknesses.
Okay, thank you. But I hope you can remember my first question. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. And I just want to note that I think that, in answer to your second question, anyway, that the way you asked your question, coming to an event like this, engaging with others and trying to find out how do they think about these issues is exactly the embodiment of the values that you mentioned, and that you're embodying those values. So with that, I want to thank you all so very much for coming, and I apologize for running a little bit over, but let's thank our guests, Geoffrey Stone and Azhar.